תודה רבה לגליה, בין היתר גם על המעבר בין המקרה הפרטי לכמה לקחים פנימיים. יש לי הרגשה שאני יכולה לתאר מה האנלוגיות שרבים מאיתנו, אם לא כולנו, עברו להם בראשם למקרה הפרטי הישראלי, במיוחד הישראלי-פלסטיני, תוך כדי הדברים, במיוחד המסקנות הסופיות. אנחנו עוברים לשמוע את מרק פינו, שידבר על לקחים מלבנון. מרק, סילבופלה. איך מורידים פה?
תודה רבה, בוקר טוב. That's all about the Hebrew I can remember. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I really feel humbled among this high-level audience and panel. The reason I chose to speak and to write about this topic, the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire of 1996, is first of all because I was not part of the negotiation, but part of its implementation. I was posted as a deputy chief of mission at the French embassy from 1996 to 2000, exactly the time when this agreement was in force. And so I had a chance to be part of not only observing it, but also be associated with the French co-chair of the monitoring group. And the second reason, of course, is apart from making me feel younger, is also the fact that I discovered that there was very little literature, actually very little research on this specific topic, apart from a very interesting book written by one of the Israeli members of the Israeli delegation, so which, of course, helped me in my research. So, because we are running a little bit short of time and I don't want to delay your coffee break too much, I will boil down my remarks to 9 points, which are the 9 lessons and recommendations that I drew from this experience. And we'll see whether they're still relevant and applicable to other cases. Only 9, sorry, couldn't reach 10 like the 10 commandments. Next time I'll be a little bit more imaginative. But number 1, my assumption, my theory is that in most cases multilateral approaches are more effective than unilateral ones. Of course, we can discuss this and whether it applies to all cases, but if you look at the history of the Middle East, I think you're probably will agree that in most cases, unilateral moves by either of the actors are usually leading to a worse situation than the status quo ante. There are a number of examples, like I won't go into the details. Second lesson is that in some cases, preference should be given to realistic short-term goals over ambitious peace plans. This is, of course, the case when the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire took place, as Professor Rabinovich recalled, in the context of attempts of negotiations on a Syrian track. But because these attempts were not successful, this short-term approach of a ceasefire to reduce casualties on civilians, both in Israel and in Lebanon, was a more successful approach. Third lesson is that mediation, which also was mentioned by Professor Rabinovich, is that it has a better chance of success if it seeks balanced results. And in this case, Israel-Lebanon ceasefire, this was evident. The search for mutual obligations was critical to success. Now, as we know, in the Middle East, there is a sort of history and tradition or culture of revenge, which leads to cycles of violent acts and responses. And especially now in the current situation, we are witnessing forms of asymmetric conflict where we have powerful states and non-state actors. And we can, again, discuss this, whether the traditional mechanisms applicable to states would be applicable to some of the new state actors. But in this case, it was important that states were parties to this agreement, and Syria and Lebanon were, as states, held responsible for the acts of Hezbollah as a non-state actor. But at the same time, the US and French mediators were also aware of the need for consensus that obviously required mutual concessions. Sometimes they went through face-saving devices like a public apology in case of unintentional casualties. And there was this fiction, officially, even Syria and Lebanon, as representatives, did not speak formally to Israel in these meetings. They would only speak to the co-chairs. And obviously, this was a fiction because there was indeed some negotiation, some communication, which sometimes was even very direct between Israeli and Syrian representatives. And in any case, this sort of consensus approach was seen as more effective and superior to the zero-sum game approach, consisting in scoring points but losing lives. First lesson is that timing is critical, obviously, in crisis negotiations. In 1993, the first ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, in the recent period, it took only a week to achieve a result. 93, 96, the same mediator, Warren Christopher, with different approaches, but this sense of urgency was present, and of course, this was a reason for success. In the monitoring system that was put into place, this sense of urgency was still there, because whenever an incident occurred and one party filed a complaint to the co-chairs, the meeting was supposed to take place. The committee was convened within 24 or 48 hours. Now, in some cases, they just waited for a sort of backlog of complaints before addressing all of them. And outside the meetings, the chair also was helpful for emergency communications between the parties in case of incidents. What happened later in the 2006 Lebanon war, it took 18 days for the US to start putting pressure on parties to come to a ceasefire. Of course, in these 18 days, a lot of civilian casualties occurred on both sides, and there was some escalation. And the irony was that just like in 1996, this abstention of the mediator, which resulted in hundreds of casualties, was reversed only after a new bloodshed in Cana. Remember, the 1996 ceasefire was initiated because of the massacre in Cana. Now, fifth lesson is that when third-party mediators are involved in negotiations, they must agree to work intensively with all the parties and focus on results. Now, again, in 1996, the US mediator actually traveled to the region. In 1993, he just made phone calls. And as Ambassador Rabinovich reminded, there was also a French attempt of mediation. And the French foreign ministers spent 13 days shuttling between Beirut, Damascus, and Jerusalem. And this is unprecedented for a French politician also active in a domestic scene. And this achieved this result because of personal involvement, perseverance of high-level political figures, of course backed by strong national interest and competent teams of advisors. Can this always succeed? Now we have seen the personal involvement of Secretary of State Kerry in the recent attempts on the Palestinian track, which unfortunately didn't succeed, but because of maybe other external reasons. Sixth lesson, leaders involved in negotiations on an agreement to stop violence should also assume the responsibility of the implementation through a verification mechanism, especially in a context of mistrust that is characteristic to this region. So this is why this monitoring group was so successful. It involved powerful third-party mediators backed by the UN and capable of leveraging respect for the agreement. And so it gave a chance to hold some parties which were responsible for incidents or casualties to make them accountable for these violations. So the mechanisms enjoyed credibility and ownership of the parties, and it helped strengthening confidence in compliance with the agreement. Can we apply this today? Well, you could say that another example is the Iran deal on Iran's nuclear program. It was based on mistrust. It is based on mistrust. It's not like the Reagan motto, trust but verify. In this case, it's mistrust and verify. So this is why there is a very strong mechanism for verification. Seventh lesson, the choice of mediators and negotiators, both on national and professional criteria, can be decisive. In 1996, of course, Warren Christopher was effective because he had this experience from 1993, but he was also backed by very competent experts like Dennis Ross or Martin Indyk. And of course, on the Israeli side, as we know, Ambassador Rabinovich was one of the key negotiators. Also, Uri Lubrani, David Tzur, you of course are very familiar with these names. On the French side, some also diplomats who knew about the Middle East, who had been posted in the region or in charge of the Middle East desk, were also instrumental. So it's always important to select people for their experience and knowledge and negotiation skills, legal argumentation, imaginative solutions, and of course ability to withstand some psychological pressure. Eighth lesson, negotiations like these involving both military and civilians are effective when the division of labor between them is very clear. Usually, as you know, most of you have this military background, you accept the authority of the political level, but the civilians agree also to rely on your expertise on defense equipment, situations on the ground, etc. And communications among the military from whichever country is usually very straightforward, based on this commonality of culture, sense of duty and discipline in the chain of command. And it was a case in this monitoring group when military representatives from all sides accepted the technical evidence resulting from investigation very easily because, again, they just couldn't deny this. But at the same time, the diplomats were arguing on legal aspects or political merits of the case, etc. So it's important to have this clear division of tasks and have trust among each group on the expertise of the other. Finally, and I will conclude this with this, confidentiality is critical during the whole negotiation process. I'm sure you've had many experience in this, especially when there is in crisis situations, when there's media pressure, political posturing, leakages to the press, it's important to preserve some confidentiality. This doesn't necessarily exclude recourse to publicity at one stage, especially when there is already some agreement. So you need publicity not of the discussion, not of the debates, but of the outcome. And this may play a role in achieving these outcomes. So this is a dual approach which explained the success of the 1996 agreement. All the discussions were kept confidential. The chair and co-chair were very careful to collect all the written statements, not to leak them to the media, to abstain from publicly mentioning national positions, and the delegates followed these rules, maybe out of fear of backfire or retaliation. And even several years after the fact, the testimonies given, for instance, in the Israeli expert Adia Waltman in his book, all these testimonies remain anonymous. So this assurance that only agreed language, which was the result of these press releases negotiated on the basis of consensus, only this agreed language would be made public, even when it meant admitting responsibility. In many cases, Israel admitted publicly that it was responsible for collateral damage. And in some cases, Lebanon agreed that Hezbollah did violate the ceasefire. So this basis actually contributed to the building of confidence and credibility of the mechanism. Of course, it didn't stop each party from politically exploiting critical language towards the enemy or highlighting its own conduct as legitimate, but at least it had the merit of restricting the conflict to the level of propaganda or ideological warfare, which, as you know, is always safer in the short term for both military and civilian lives. So these are my conclusions and recommendations, and I'll be happy to.
Thank you, Marc, for sharing with us your well-thought insights. I'm sure there's a lot to discuss and elaborate upon with regard to the two topics of Turkey and the Kurds and Israel and Lebanon. But because our schedule is quite tight, we'll turn now to the coffee break. And יש עוד הרבה בספר, I'm switching to Hebrew, יש עוד הרבה בספר, על זה נאמר זיל גמור, ניפגש פה אחרי הפסקת